Hi, I'm Rachel.
And I'm Matt.
Welcome to the Strange and Beautiful Book Club. It's time for another Dark Tower book. Dark Tower Book 3, The Wastelands. Or as I like to think of it, the LFG book. The Let's Finally Fucking Go. So the LFFG book of the Dark Tower series. I think you can kind of categorize the Dark Tower like this if you're trying to sell somebody on reading it. The first book is like the obligatory training course that you have to go through every time you start a new RPG.
Yep.
Where you have some small initial quest that later will feel like literally the smallest thing that could ever have possibly happened in this video game, but that you have to get through in order to learn all the skills, learn the world, and
yeah, it's easing you into the world.
Yeah.
It's the training course for the series.
And it's unskippable.
Because
of course,
if you skip it, you'll be missing vital information later on.
Right. Until you replay the game, and then you can opt out of the initial training. I mean, that's a good way to look at it. And then the second one is the gathering of the party part of, like, you know, the original Final Fantasy games where you started with you and like maybe your best friend. And then you had to
pick
go
up
around.
people along the way.
Yeah, you had to go
they'd
around
say,
and pick them up.
So-and-so joined the party.
Right. And then you had to figure out how to fight together, and you all had different skill sets, and you leveled up as time went on. That's exactly what the second book is. And then the third book is you finally built your party, except for the secret fourth character.
Right.
That you don't get till way later in the game. I'm looking at you, Vincent.
Vincent in Final Fantasy VII.
Yes,
yeah.
I'm looking at you, Vincent. And then we can finally start the game.
The main story.
Yeah, the main story. Game, story, whatever. So we've got Eddie, we've got Roland, and we've got Susannah.
The multitude of Susannah.
Yes. Well, it's Susannah integrated.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Susannah with flavors.
Yeah, with different...
Sometimes she changes the theme of her user interface.
Which is nice because it gives her a lot of options for what, you know. And we cover a lot of ground in this book. Like a lot of ground.
Literally and narratively.
And I did go back and read Dark Tower 1. Revised. And I have to say I would recommend doing that. And it's really funny because the introduction to it.
Yeah.
Stephen King made every single complaint that we did. He goes, it didn't match. It felt like it was written by a different writer. There were references to like Farson, who later books is a place. Or in this book, in the first version of the Dark Tower is a place, but later in the Dark Tower is a person.
Mm-hmm.
So he edited for clarity, content, and to make it match. And it does. And he adds a lot of references to what's coming. Like he mentions Lud. He mentions several other things that are going to happen in the Wastelands.
And you prognosticated accidentally in the revised version, Walter and Martin are the same person.
Yes. Yeah. After getting confused, having to correct myself, we find out in the revised version that they're not two people. It's literally like, you know, the meme where the guy rips the mustache off and there's just another mustache underneath. And they're like, it's like that. Exactly like that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he's like, oh my God, you were both of them all along. And he's like, I mean, yeah. Which makes way more sense because now you're like, wait, who was Martin? Where did he go? How come Walter is a lesser guy, but he's the one we've been chasing? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
So it works, and it's good. I would read the revised version.
I don't know that the revised version is available as an audiobook.
I think it is.
Okay.
He revised it in like 2003. So the revised version is 20 years old.
The audiobook that I just listened to.
Of The Dark Tower?
Of The Dark Tower, The Gunslinger, the first one.
You didn't listen to the audiobook of the first one. You read the book with me.
That's an extremely good point.
Yeah.
Thank you for clarifying that.
We read the same book. And then you said maybe when I read The Dark Tower the first time, I listened to the revised audiobook.
That makes sense.
Yeah. If you're listening to anything done after 2003, it's probably the revised version.
And the audiobooks were all in 2016.
Yeah. And I tried listening to the audiobook of The Wasteland. I did. And I made it it felt like 2 hours in, and I was like, oh yeah, I'm making good progress. I got to be like 30% of the way through the book. And then I picked up the physical book to see where I was at in the book, and I was like 40 pages in. So I think that sort of like in Roland's world where time moves differently, when I'm reading and or listening to The Dark Tower, time becomes meaningless because I did the same thing with the second book where I thought that the section with Detta and Odetta was like half the book.
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, no, it's like an hour. I'm like, no, it felt like half the book. Like it felt like a long time. And I really don't think it was, but I think that was just my perception of it.
Yeah.
But you can tell pretty much immediately that this is going to be a very different book because we start off with action. I mean, we started off with action in the second one where the lobstrosities were eating Roland. But in this one, it's like, okay, how about a 70-foot tall bear that's slowly making its way towards them? And it's Roland going through a training montage with Eddie and Susannah.
Right.
And he's trying to show Susannah how to shoot. And she's like, they're just rocks. And he's like, no.
No, they aren't.
No, they aren't. And then he goes through like, did you like it when those men hurt you and locked you in a cage? Did you like it when you got pushed and you got your legs cut off? Like, that's who those rocks are. Those rocks are those men who hurt you. The rocks are the man who pushed you.
Yeah.
She's like, you are a son of a bitch, Roland. And he's like, I mean, yeah, fair. But then she shoots and she hits all of them. And he's like,
except for the last one.
Well, she clips it. She clips it.
She thinks she missed the last one. And he's like, think again, bitch.
He just says, he's like, look again. But he makes them do the mantra.
I think everything Roland says,
you could just end with bitch.
You could follow with bitch or motherfucker.
Yeah.
And that would communicate his like facial expression.
His tone. Yeah.
So after
but
the
he makes her do the mantra.
Yeah.
If a man who shoots with his hand but she gets to say woman. The woman who shoots with her hand has forgotten the face of her father. I shoot with my heart or whatever. And it's interesting how much we come back to that because they're like, oh, this is stupid. And then every time they have to go into like a gunslinger moment, they're like, oh yeah, the mantra really helped me get into the mindset I needed to be in to kill people.
And that's a signature of any kind of like mental training. Like if you're doing meditation, if you're any kind of cognitive training, or even for physical stuff like sports, you do this like preparation. You mentally
clear the mechanism.
Yeah.
Wasn't that from oh my God, what movie was that from? It's one of the ones with Kevin Costner where he's a baseball player.
Oh, okay.
And every time he goes to pitch, he goes, clear the mechanism. And then it
and it
like slows everything down for him.
It kind of narrows down your perception to what's relevant for this task I'm about to do. And at first, you have to do it deliberately and like intentionally step through the whole process. But then after you do it enough, it's boom. You do it instantly.
Yeah.
And then like thinking back, you realize, oh, if I think back to that moment of transition, I did go through the mantra.
Yeah.
I just did it so fast I didn't even notice it at the time.
Yeah. But I was actually listening to the first part on audiobook, and I'm walking around the store shopping and listening to a 70-foot tall parasite infested bear attacking Eddie. And I was like actively nauseous. And I'm like, man, did I eat something weird this morning? What's going on? And then I realized, no, this section is so gross. It's so gross. Stephen King is one of the few authors who can make me physically nauseous in the way that he describes the things that are happening.
Mm-hmm.
Like the bear sneezes on Eddie.
And he's covered in
And
wriggling parasites.
Yeah, sprays him with wriggling white parasites in his face and in his mouth. And I was like, ugh. Oh, God. Like, it sounds so disgusting. Like he says, and then the bear, its head still cocked back to look at him, sneezed. Eddie was immediately drenched in hot snot that was filled with thousands of small white worms. They wriggled frantically on his shirt, his forearms, his throat, his face. Gross.
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 Really gross.
But they end up shooting this bear's thinking cap, which is its like receiver dish on the top of its head that spins around. And we keep mentioning that as we see things from the point of view of the bear. But we don't realize it's actually like this bear is part mechanical. It's like a cyborg. And it's thousands of years old because it's been protecting the source of the beam. And this is the first time, if you don't read the revised version, that we make any mention of there being something directing the reality, which is the
some
beam.
kind of energy field or force or artificial thing influencing the physical world.
Right. Because in the revised version, when he's talking to Alice and he asks her what's across the desert, she says nothing goes over there, but there is something that seems to whisk the clouds in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Everything serves the beam.
As if he's been traveling on this beam. Although there's multiple beams.
Right.
Because he draws out a diagram of all the beams.
There's 12 gates.
Yeah, and so 6 beams between. And so they're following the bear and the turtle beam. And so Roland knows the rhyme for the turtle. Like he holds us all upon his back.
And Eddie knows it too.
He says it. When does he say it? I think it's more of like remember he says that because they're quartet, they share like a psychic connection.
So this reminds me of when I was reading into lore on the Cosmere, Brandon Sanderson's Cosmere. Reading about Wit/Hoyd. The Hoyd character moves between all the novels in the Cosmere. But one of his abilities, skills, whatever, is capital C connection.
Yeah.
Which means anywhere he goes, he has a spiritual connection with the place and the people that live in that place. And he just, like, by osmosis, gets a lot of cultural references
and language
for free. He doesn't have to study the languages. He just automatically speaks the language. And it only becomes a problem when he tries to speak specific idioms in his natural language that don't match the world's
flavor
vernacular.
The
lingo, I guess idioms. I already said idioms. But.
Yeah. He gets all the cultural references, which is the hardest part about learning a language.
Yep.
So it's good and cheap and easy. And that's a great move for Brandon Sanderson because he doesn't have to be like, and then Hoyd lived for 35 years upon this orb before he figured out how to communicate with everybody.
But I get some sense of that with Susannah and Eddie.
Yeah.
Because Susannah keeps seeing flashes of what things were actually like in the past, in the places that they go. And Eddie gets a little bit of that, but not as much.
Right. He gets different things. Yeah. But because they are all quartet, which Roland says he's not really part of their group. He's like tangential to their quartet.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a really interesting mythology to develop for us because it explains a lot of their unusual connection.
And it skips a lot of things where you'd have to justify, time or deliberate practice.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's why they all learn shooting guns so quickly.
Right, because Roland is right there and he can sort of transfer that knowledge. It's not unlike Sense8 where they all can share each other's memories but it's not that deep of a sharing yet. It's just a like tacit connection that they can use to sort of like communicate on a deeper level.
Right. Send short messages of words and or memories, sensations, whatever, but it's not like I'm going to have a long form telepathic communication with you.
Yeah, and it's also tied up with fate because it's also Ka, which Roland says means destiny, but it's like
There's
like
nuance.
anything in high
layers.
speech, it has layers. But Ka-tet is like your destiny group, like the party you are destined to move through whatever thing is going to happen to you together.
Mm-hmm.
Except Roland, he's not a full part of their Ka-tet, which I think is interesting. Because that means his fate is not joined with theirs.
Right.
Which I'm sure will develop more in the next, 4 books? We're only 5. I think there's 8 total books in the series, and this is the 3rd one. And he really builds the mythology in this one, like a lot. Then the second one we get some, but in this one we get like the rose and the key and the beam and the idea that this is both mystical, but it could also be a sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
Mm-hmm.
Some society became so advanced that they literally unglued the world.
Or far enough back in time, a sufficiently advanced society took a disorganized, chaotic world / multiverse and pinned it together with the Dark Tower and the beams. Yeah. But that system is degrading.
Right. One or the other.
Yeah.
And it's a cool way to build mythology because it's not
kind of like the Margaret Wise and Tracy Hickman books with the
Death Gate cycle.
The Death Gate cycle.
It reminded me a lot of the Death Gate cycle.
Where they accidentally destroyed the world and then they had to use their new magic stuff to rebuild it, reassemble everything. Right. Maybe that's what happened with the Dark Tower.
And that's because of like nuclear war. It split people and then it created magic in the world. Yeah. Which is...
Although we find out that elves were always there.
Okay.
Hiding. And they just came out.
Okay. Well,
anyway,
I always like an original way to generate magic. Like it's fine for there to be a fantasy world where magic just exists. Okay. Yeah. Oh, okay. But also, hey, we fucked up real bad and now magic exists that's a cool storyline. Yeah. We literally created this super advanced technology and then we went to war. And the effects of our war
altered the fabric of reality so much that magic exists now.
And Roland actually clarifies why it took him so long to get to the man in black. He's like, oh yeah, it was a distance of 1,000 miles, but it took me 20 years to cross it. And they're like, what do you mean? And he's like, because literally the world is moving on. Distance and time have no meaning.
Right. The world is growing.
Because the world is coming apart at the seams. Mm-hmm. So reality is a fluid concept. Distance is a fluid concept. Time is a fluid concept. And poor Roland is actually going a little bit crazy for part of the book because remember, he saved Jake in the drawing of the 3.
Yeah.
And it created a divergent path where he both remembers that Jake died and remembers that Jake did not die. So he's like Schrodinger's Jake.
Yeah, there's the timeline through the first book where he remembers being with Jake and all the things that happened with Jake. But then internally, there's his other memories of, I never met a boy at the way station. I rode that minecart alone with the slow mutants.
Yeah.
And nobody fell like off a cliff or whatever.
Oh, but they also did. They did not.
There was a boy. There was no boy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Eddie's like, well, at least you saved him. So in the end, you didn't have to kill Jake. And he's like, okay, but I'm literally coming apart. I'm going insane because I can remember him both being alive and dead. What do you think Jake feels? How do you suppose it feels to know you are dead in one world and alive in another? And they're all like, oh, shit.
Yeah, if this is happening to me, it's probably also happening to Jake.
Right. So they follow the path of the bear, which luckily the bear felt compelled to crush trees as it walked. So it left a nice big path for them to follow. And when they get to the clearing where the bear used to live, there are all these little automatons that used to be part of the bear's sort of entourage, but now are breaking down. And one of them is the stainless steel rat. And that's a reference, and I stand by that.
Oh, it's got to be.
It's got it. There's no other reason for him to specifically describe it as a stainless steel rat.
Right.
If he wasn't referring to
the book series, The Stainless Steel Rat.
Yeah.
Which is, it's decent. I read, I don't know, 3 or 4 of them. And they're fairly short, adventure, kind of noir detective con man kind of character. It was very reminiscent of Jean Leflember in The Quantum Thief.
Right, but it's super early cyberpunk.
Yeah, but it's, like 20 years, 30 years earlier.
Right.
Or
it's one of those foundational sci-fi novels that you don't necessarily see people read a lot of, but the tropes and things that happen in it have pervaded their way through the entire genre.
Right. And it feels formulaic to read them now, but that's only because it was revolutionary. It was novel at the time, and the mechanisms that that those books contained got reused, copy pasted by so many people that it's just okay. Here's a standard tool set for storytelling.
And that book series is The Stainless Steel Rat by Harry Harrison.
Which is Harry short for Harrison? Is his name Harrison?
Let's go with it because it sounds really
good. I wonder if that's it's Henry. Henry Maxwell Dempsey, and he changed his name, or maybe his pseudonym was Harry
Harrison.
Max Harrison.
Okay.
Let's see. Known mostly for Stainless Steel Rat and for his novel Make Room, where Make Room was the rough basis for Soylent Green.
Oh.
But let's see, when was that book series published? Through the 60s.
So a long time ago. Golden Age sci-fi?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, all the way through the 70s, 80s. Wow, he was writing all the way into the 90s.
Wow.
Oh, the Stainless Steel Rat series goes into the 90s, and
I mean, he
published book 11 in 2010.
Aww.
And book 10 in 1999.
Well, they come from the era of the John Carter on Mars,
writing.
The John Carter on Mars series, where they were like a magazine. You just wrote them and wrote them and wrote them and wrote them. And they may have built on each other, but who gave a shit? They were adventure stories.
Right.
And so they're all inspired by these long-running series, and they don't have to connect in the way we now think of books as connecting.
You don't need a whole, multi-book series story arc.
Right.
Generally, the beginning and the end of the book, the characters in a similar situation, similar status.
Yeah.
Except there might be I got through that with my life and this new car or something.
Yeah. I've changed something, but not something so fundamental that now I'm in trouble and you're waiting to find out what happens to me. Every single book has a resolution, and they may build on each other, but they all resolve. Kind of like old school television used to work, where every single episode was like a single storyline.
Yep.
So of course you could keep writing for 50 years. It was like, ooh, another stainless steel episode. I think I'll go read it.
You don't have to keep track of, what are the 17 plot hints that I dropped in my previous books that I have to make sure I account for in this book.
Like Patrick Rothfuss, cough, cough. If he ever finishes it, people will have to go back and read the first 2 because it's been, I don't even know,
15 years.
15 years since he last published. Or say J.V. Jones with her series.
Mm-hmm.
When she finishes her series that had one more book in it, it's been 20 years pretty much.
I think the last one was published in 2013, 10 years ago.
Yeah. It's been a while. So anyway, they find themselves in this clearing, and it's where the beam of the bear starts. And so because of the way it's arranged, each beam goes through the tower and then onto its connecting side on the other side. So if they follow this beam, they will arrive at the tower.
Yep.
And Roland does this whole thing with a needle where he shows them how the needle will direct them down the beam. But he's like,
they're trying to figure out what's the actual mechanism. Is it magnetism?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's magnetism.
Sort of.
Is it air currents? Well, kinda.
Yeah, they're all secondary side effects of the beam.
Right. All the things that you can measure are just the downstream effects of the beam.
So he does this whole thing with a needle where he puts it in a bowl of water and it shows them the path of the beam, but he's like, we don't need it. And then they look and all the branches are growing in that direction and all of the clouds are moving in that direction.
Yeah, and Susannah can't quite see it. And Eddie's like, oh no, don't look at specific things. Look at the shadows.
Yeah.
And
Look
then
at the shape of it. Yeah.
Susannah can see it. Yeah.
And because everything serves the beam.
Is it everything serves the beam or all things serve the beam?
It doesn't matter. Both.
Okay.
It doesn't matter because everything serves the beam in the end. So Roland is like, okay, gunslingers, let's go. Like, we found our quest. We figured it out.
We found our trailhead.
Susannah shot the bear. Eddie shot the automatons in the clearing. He's like, you are now officially gunslingers because you've shot shit. So let's go. And Eddie's like, wait. What if I told you I don't want to be a gunslinger? I'd say that what you want doesn't much matter. Roland was looking at the metal kiosk, which stood against the rock wall, and seemed to have lost interest in the conversation. Eddie had seen this before. When the conversation turned to questions of should be, could be, or ought to be, Roland almost always lost interest. Ka? Eddie asked with a trace of his old bitterness. That's right. Ka. Which, let me tell you, we've been having a lot of fun using ka in conversations. I don't want to do that. You have to.
Ka, Rachel.
So they start on the path of the beam, and this really begins our journey. Like, this is like 100 pages in or so, and it's our setup. Roland is going crazy. Eddie and Susannah are following him, but it's like, wow, the most dangerous person that we know, and literally the only other human that we have encountered in the months and months that we have been here, is slowly losing his mind. This is going to go great. Let's follow the path of the beam.
Yeah.
And I mean, a lot happens, but a lot doesn't happen. There's just a lot of buildup. And then we end up flipping back and forth between Jake and Roland and company. Because we find out that Jake has also been going slowly mad.
Yep.
And he writes his final essay. And my favorite part about the final essay is that he leaves, he runs because he's like, oh God, they're going to realize it. They're going to realize you're crazy because who writes that shit? Like,
right, because for 3 weeks, he's been just barely keeping his life together.
Yeah.
Because 3 weeks ago, on the morning of May 9th, I think, he died.
Right.
But he didn't die. And so he's been struggling with this, and he hasn't told anyone that he's having trouble, that he's having these double memories. But yeah, well, after his mental split, his mental break,
yeah,
he does his final essay for his English class, and he doesn't remember doing it.
Right.
But now, 3 weeks later, his teacher gives it back.
Well, no, it's the same day. He gets it back the same night.
Day?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because he takes it in that morning and he opens his folder and it's just text that's like, Roland is the gunslinger and that is the truth. Blaine is a pain and that is the truth. And the end is like choo choo, choo choo, choo choo, choo choo. And like the title page.
With cutout glued pictures.
Yeah, the title page is a cutout glued picture of a train. And then like the last page is a cutout glued on picture of the Leaning Tower of Pisa that he's colored completely black. And he's like, oh shit. they're going to know. They're going to send me to the loony bin. I can't stay here. So he's like, hey, can I go to the bathroom? Oh, can I step out or whatever? Because he's at a fancy school.
Because it would be too crude to just say, can I go pee?
Rich kids don't shit, basically. So
they don't admit to each other that they shit.
Yeah. So he's like, okay, I got to go. So he leaves, and then he ends up just going on a walk because Ka is driving him. And so he ends up at what sounds like the coolest bookstore I've ever heard of, the Manhattan Restaurant of the Mind.
Yeah.
And it's like now serving hot, and then it says the author name, and then it has like bistro tables with different arrangements of books on it. And there's a coffee bar that people are sitting at reading and drinking coffee. Stephen King, I petition you actually make the Manhattan Restaurant of the Mind. And the best part about this is when I was reading the introduction to one of the books, he gives a lengthy introduction at the beginning of every one. And he's always like, I know. I said, don't do lengthy introductions because Stephen King wrote that book about writing.
Yeah.
And in the book about writing, he's like, don't do that. Nobody cares. But then he keeps putting these long ones in here and he's like, I know, but I feel compelled. Like I have to put this in here. And he said that he doesn't know what's going to happen from book to book. That he literally
he doesn't have the whole arc planned out?
He literally just sits down and writes it. And so to have these connecting threads all the way through it, and he's pantsing this, is wild. Because he buys the Choo Choo book, Charlie the Choo Choo, which I just bought. Like I found it at a used bookstore.
Right,
and I was
because
like,
Stephen King went ahead and wrote Charlie the Choo Choo.
And the inscription on the cover, the
author like recommendation quote.
Yeah, you know, the quote that they always put on there that's from another author that's like, wow, this was the best book I ever wrote or ever read. And then author name, it said, if I ever wrote a children's book, it would be this one, Stephen King.
Right, but it's by
Beryl Evans.
Beryl Evans, who's the author in the
book.
In the Dark Tower
Stephen King
series.
wrote the children's book.
Right.
And then he credited it to
name.
Beryl Evans.
Yeah.
And then on the cover it says, if I ever wrote a children's book, it would be this one. I see you, Stephen King. I thought that's so fun.
Right, just for shits.
Yeah.
He published the children's book.
And then he goes and finds the key. He finds the key and he sees the rose and he hears like an angelic choir. And then he realizes that something is wrong. And Eddie felt the same way when he touched the box after they defeated the bear.
Right. And also one night they had a fire and he had a vision.
Yeah. And I have to imagine, that he had a vision because Roland threw the jawbone of the man in black in the fire.
That's right. And
it lit on fire. And they just saw sparks, but he saw a rose and a key. And he's like, remember the key. Remember the key. The S shape at the end. That's the trick. You have to get that right. And I love the whole Eddie storyline at the beginning of this book where he keeps hearing Henry in his head.
Yeah.
And every time Roland is like, are you listening to Henry again right now?
He seems to visit you a lot, Eddie.
And then finally he confronts him. He's like, you need to grow the fuck up and you need to get the other voices out of your head and you need to just do this. And he's like, I can't see the key anymore. I don't even know how to sculpt it correctly anymore. And he's like, that's because you've let fear put a blindfold over your eyes. You're like, I love Roland so much. He's the character that could never carry a book on his own. If it was just him as the main character.
Roland? Yeah.
For every single book, he'd be exhausting.
Yeah.
But if you combine him with characters that need guidance, he suddenly becomes like the coolest fucking character possible.
Right.
And I love it.
I liked that the line, I think towards the beginning of the book, from Eddie's perspective, where he's struggling with the voice of his brother in his head. And specifically, he's struggling with wanting to spend time carving, but having this like trauma response from his brother, always making fun of him anytime he was doing something he was good at or enjoyed. And so he's embarrassed to carve where Roland or Susannah can see him. And he says something like, sure, I beat heroin, but try beating your childhood.
Yeah. It's child's play next to beating your childhood, is what he says. Yeah. Yeah, correct. I know that exact mindset.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know that exact one. I can't let anybody see what I'm doing because they're just going to mock me.
Right.
I felt for Eddie through this whole section where he is just really struggling to do a thing, but he is so beaten down by the memory
because
of
it
his
resonates
brother.
with you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That I was like, wow, I get it. Being like, I'd rather quit and not try and not be ridiculed for failing than try and fail and then try again. Like, because there's always consequences.
Right.
For failure. There's consequences for success and there's consequences for failure. So trying becomes very difficult. And he has to struggle through that in a very believable way for a very long time.
Right.
And I really like how Roland is very subtly pushing him and pushing Susannah without being very blatant about it. And Susannah is the only one who sees it. She's like, I see you, Roland. I see you. I see you. That's when she asks him, how many languages do you speak? And he's like, 5, maybe more, but the world has moved on. So I'm not sure if the other ones are relevant anymore. And she's like, so Roland is a lot smarter than he lets on.
Yeah.
And then he says shit like this, where they're like, why don't you tell us about your your past? Why don't you tell us your stories? And he goes, someday, if there's time, I'll tell you all the old stories, the ones I know. At least, they form a large tapestry, one which is beautiful, but very sad. Because he's like we don't know how old he is.
How old are you, Roland?
And I don't know if it's in the original one too.
It's not in the original one.
Okay. In the revised version of the gunslinger, the man in black tells him, you're immortal just like me, with limitations.
Or nearly immortal?
Yeah, you're nearly immortal just like me, but with limitations.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, okay, Roland has been chasing the man in black for 20 years. He had a whole ass life before that.
With a, like, kingdom level revolution that he got kicked out for.
Yeah.
And
then 10 years passed while he was talking to the man in black.
Yeah.
So that's 30 years.
30 years after his whole life in Gilead.
Which we don't know how long that was. And
where
everyone's
there was
like,
this
Gilead,
whole long war.
Everyone's like, Gilead doesn't exist anymore.
We haven't had a gunslinger in these parts in 300 years.
Yeah.
Is what Blaine tells him.
Yeah. Even though there's a statue of a gunslinger in the train station where Blaine is.
There's a statue of Roland.
Correct.
With the fingers missing.
Right. I love it. Like, that's how you build a world, okay? That's how you make me go, oh, why? Oh. And then you don't whack me over the head with it.
Right. This is really, really good, like, surreal fantasy world building.
Yeah.
Because there's just all these hints of interconnections that feel like, wow, something really, really big is going on.
Right.
And we're not seeing how it's connected. What the fuck?
And he gets to let the characters see it and see it for what it is without making them absolutely moronic. Like, I'm trying to read a book right now that was recommended, and the main character is so dumb. I'm really struggling. And the only reason they're dumb is because everything is so obvious. If they were even slightly more intelligent, they would figure it out too fast.
Right.
But Stephen King is very good about having his characters follow improv rules where they're like, yes, and. Yes, and. So they see this statue and it's clearly Roland. And they're like, okay, yep, that's a statue of Roland. Fuck, there's a statue of Roland here. I accept that. And I'm going to figure it out later. I'm sure
not going to dwell on it right now.
I'm just going to file this away because this might be relevant later, but I'm just going to leave it. There's Roland right there. Okay. All right. Now what? And I love it because we get to have these really intelligent, really highly observant characters, and they don't have to move in and out of being observant in order to function in the world and to make the world interesting and mysterious.
Right.
Because the world is built well and the characters are built well.
Right. There's no crutches of ignorance built into the plot.
Right. And when there are, it's believable and you're okay with it.
Mm-hmm.
Because they don't have to change who they are as characters. He is phenomenal at creating very consistent characters. And we get Jake back like halfway through the book.
Right.
Because both of them, when they hold the key, it silences the voices. So then we are
for Jake and Roland.
So then we're able to progress through what's happening. The plot line to get Jake back. And it turns out that Jake has to interact with Eddie in past New York and go to this haunted mansion and sneak into this haunted mansion. And then he uses the key on the correct door while the house itself is coming alive and chasing after him.
Yeah.
And he drops the key and it goes through the floorboard. And this is why Stephen King gets made into movies so often, is because he's very cinematic in the way that he builds tension and then the way he resolves the tension. Because you have Eddie on the one side trying to unlock a dirt door with a wooden key, and he has to keep fine-tuning the key because it's not quite working.
Yep.
And then we have Jake, who's trying to get the key in the lock, drops it, has to pry up a floorboard, gets grabbed by a house monster. He has to take his pants off. Like, it's very dramatic. And all through this, they're in another speaking ring. So we have
So there's another demon there.
Another speaking demon. And this time it is male. And so Susannah is the one who has to distract it.
Yeah.
Which I normally would be like, is that assault? And it kind of is. But also the way that he writes it is very... Roland would have done it if it was female.
Right.
Whoever. And it just so happened to be that
they
Susannah
knew
had
about
to be
it
the one.
beforehand. And like they were prepared for what was going to happen and chose to do it deliberately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it happens. And it's I'm not horrifically not okay with it. It ends up being like she takes over the situation and traps it instead of her trapping her being trapped by it.
Mm-hmm.
And then she releases it into our world.
Into the house.
Which
is also a kind of spirit demon thing.
Well, it's
that's
the same
just
place,
disguising.
probably.
Yeah.
Well, we don't know.
They're connected.
They're connected in some way, fundamentally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the it's kind of implying that places like haunted houses and are the speaking rings of our reality. They're where things are thin. And that's why Jake can pass through there. So they pull Jake out and they're like, great, now we have the whole party. Now we've got everybody.
And it completely resolves the conflicting memories within both Jake and Roland.
Right, because now
Jake
they're together.
Is actually in this world, and Roland can resolve Jake. The diverging timeline thing.
Yeah.
With Jake.
It closes the loop.
Yeah.
And so they continue down this path, and we meet the first people we've met in literally 2 books. We haven't interact with any characters, not Roland, not Eddie,
humans.
Not Susannah, and not Jake, since The Man in Black at the end of Gunslinger. In Roland's world. Yeah. So we finally meet, and they're all old. And Roland calls it. He's like, oh, they're going to be old people. It's fine. And they're like, oh my God, a gunslinger. Yay. And this is when Susannah is like, oh, this is who he's supposed to be.
Right.
He's supposed to be like a wandering diplomat.
Right.
Like,
he's not this lone wolf vigilante.
Yeah.
He's a knight errant.
Yeah. That's exactly what he's supposed to be.
Yeah.
A wandering lawman.
Mm-hmm.
Because apparently this was inspired by Stephen King watching The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Yes, he was inspired by all the spaghetti westerns.
Yeah. And he was like, oh, yeah, I could combine Tolkien and spaghetti westerns and make The Tower, which explains so many things. But after this small town, they get like fed, and then he's like, okay, we're going to eat, and then we got to leave. Like, we just got to go. And And Jake's like, I don't know why we couldn't have stayed. And Eddie's like, okay, so we stay. And they're like, hey, thank you guys for the food. Do you think you could help us dig a new well?
Well, Eddie says right away, what's the first thing he said? Because we don't want to like fix their toilet or something.
Yeah. Like, we don't want to stay. And then you get deeper and deeper into helping them.
And Jake's like, what do you mean? Like, it's just like, or fixing the roof or something.
Yeah.
I forget what his first example is. And Jake's like, that would be bad. And Eddie's like, no, I will elaborate.
Yeah. He's like, it would be great. It would be fine. It wouldn't make it any easier to leave. It would delay us. And in the end, it wouldn't help anybody. And they are heading towards this city, like a big city, like a New York style city.
Mm-hmm.
And I love Eddie's hopefulness. He's like, okay, so that's where the people are going to be. Actually, he says, the idea was intoxicating. An enclave of civilization in this dangerous, mostly empty world. Wise old elfmen who would tell them just what the fuck it was they were supposed to be doing. So he's hoping this is going to be like Elrond in The Last Homely House. Like, this is going to be his moment.
He's hoping for Rivendell.
Yeah. And he gets the Mines of Moria.
Yeah.
Because
that's a good analogy.
Yeah. We have to cross this bridge. Oh, and we meet Oi. Oi being the best character in the entire book.
Absolutely.
I love Oi so much, which means Oi's probably going to die, and I'm like really sad about it. But Oi is a billy bumbler.
And which is like a dog.
A little bit like a dog with a really long neck and a corkscrew tail that can talk. And they see a bunch of them earlier, and Eddie's like, the fuck are those? And Roland goes, oh, that's a billy bumbler. We don't ever mention it again. And then one shows up next to Jake, and it can talk. And Roland's just like, never actually met one that could do that. And it says oi because people keep calling Jake boy.
Yeah.
And so it says oi. So he just names it Oi. And it's really cute. And it gets scared and it doesn't want to cross the bridge. So Jake, who forgot about Oi, but that's okay, he goes back to get him, has to try to carry him across the bridge, and then he falls, and it's sort of like a bad moment from a cartoon where one person falls and the next person falls and they're all hanging onto the one person.
Yeah.
And Roland pulls everybody up, and then there's a like gangrenous guy with a yellow scarf tied around his head, because there's the pubes and the grays.
Right. The older people and the younger people.
Who are the two factions in the city. And this kicks off the final climax sort of cinematic adventure of the novel.
Yeah.
Where we go from just journeying through these empty lands and learning about ourselves to learning a little bit about the world. And this city is Lud, which makes them the Luddites. But as a Luddite myself.
Which might be a reference to their inability or their sense of awe and mystery about all of this massive technological infrastructure in the city that, is the city, like underneath the city. They don't know how it works. They can't operate it well. They can kind of use it piecemeal.
Yeah.
The Greys can. But then the pubes are treated like this semi-malevolent deity.
Yeah. Which it kind of is, because Blaine is.
Blaine is the brain behind the city. So
I just found the quote from when Eddie won't finish the key.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to read it because it's one of my favorite quotes from the whole book. And it kind of categorizes Roland for me. And he goes, you haven't finished the key, but not because you are afraid to finish. You're afraid of finding you can't finish. You're afraid to go down to where the stones stand, but not because you're afraid of what may come once you enter the circle. You're afraid of what may not come. You're not afraid of the great world, Eddie, but of the small one inside yourself. You haven't forgotten the face of your father, so do it. Shoot me if you dare, but I'm tired of watching you blubber. And then Susannah's like, stop, like you're being really mean right now. And Roland cuts his eyes towards her. I'm forcing him to decide. He looked back at Eddie, and his deeply lined face was stern. You have come from the shadow of the heroine and the shadow of your brother. Come from the shadow of yourself if you dare. Come now, come out, or shoot me and have done with it. Have done with it.
And so what this reminds me of, this dynamic between Roland and Eddie specifically, but also Roland and Susannah when he's like mentoring her, is the kind of feeling, the kind of love that you have for someone that is, I'm not just trying to like be nice to you or help you have good experiences.
Yeah.
My goal is to help the part of you inside of you that wants the best for you.
Yeah.
To become that.
Yes.
Rather than like whatever the most, external facing part of you is that may want things that aren't good for you.
Yeah.
I'm going to kind of provoke that piece inside of you that can grow into the best version of you.
Right.
And help that actually become.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then when they're in that little town and they finally see Roland interacting with someone that's not them,
Mm-hmm.
Susannah says, he's a living remnant of a past they only know from stories. They look at him the way religious people would look at one of the saints, Peter or Paul or Matthew. If you decided to drop by the Saturday night bean supper and tell them stories of how it was traipsing around the Sea of Galilee with Jesus the carpenter.
Yeah.
And I think it's a testament to how well Stephen King can hold a character in his head, that we can go from the Roland of the gunslinger, and then every time he interacts with new people, we get another glimpse at who Roland actually is without it feeling like Roland is a different character.
Right.
It's like pulling back the veil instead of gluing shit on.
Right.
And that is probably why I always forget, Stephen King is kind of like salad or apples.
Yeah.
You never remember how much you like salad or apples until you eat a salad or eat an apple. And then it's like, wow, I really enjoyed that. Why don't I eat that more often? I feel like that was Stephen King.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of Stephen King books. I've read a fair number, but yet every time I'm like, oh, Stephen King, okay.
When you're thinking, what book should I read next?
Right.
Let me look. Stephen King, I don't know.
Right.
But then you actually read it.
And then you pick it up and you're like, oh, fuck, that was great. Why don't I do that? Why do I do that to myself? And then yet next time when I go to pick up a book, just to be like, I want to read a good book right now, I guarantee you I'll look at my Stephen King shelf and go, meh.
Not today.
Not today. You know what? He's intense.
Mm-hmm.
He's very intense. He's not a sit down and just relax and read. He's you got to be in it. But after we cross the bridge and we finally catch up, or we finally sort of run face first into the conflict, which is how far down these people have fallen just by being this insular community where Blaine has literally driven them mad.
Right.
Because every day the drums play. And Eddie's like, that's like rock drums. That's not like a...
He knows the specific Led Zeppelin song that this is the drum track for.
Yeah. Oh, wait, before we cross the bridge, there was one thing I marked that I want to make sure we read because Stephen King was so generous to let us know what was happening. Eddie opened his legs and seat dropped to a sitting position. His undefended balls smashed painfully up into his crotch. But for the moment, even this exquisite pain was news from a distant country. And then he can't get up for a minute because he's going to throw up.
Yep.
He's like, oh, hang on. It just hit me. I really and even Roland is like, are your nuts okay? He's like, I need a minute. Just need a minute. Oh, when we make a George Orwell reference, I marked that too. And it's because there's speakers everywhere in the city.
Mm-hmm.
So everywhere hears the drums every single day. And I think it's a Def Leppard song. I meant to look it up because he specifically tells us what song it is. Incorrect. It's ZZ Top. It's Velcro Fly by ZZ Top. And it is quite a driving drum beat. Here, I'll play like 10 seconds so we don't get sued.
Okay. Okay, so it's a distinctive drum track.
Yeah, so no wonder Eddie was like, what? Yeah, it's Velcro Fly by ZZ Top. That's what he plays. And he just plays the drum track every single day. And at some point, they decided that the god drums were telling them to sacrifice people.
Yeah, that's totally reasonable.
So Blaine is literally driving everybody mad because Blaine is an AI. And he has become a ghost in the machine.
Right, he's become an AI whose purpose, whose environment that it was built for, I guess trained for, is the language you use now.
Yeah.
Is gone.
Right. Well, it's very reminiscent of HAL in 2001: A Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
Where he was given the directive of, always being truthful. And then they told him to hide one thing.
Yeah.
And because that was a contradiction in his programming, it slowly drove him mad. And what's happened to Blaine is that the world has moved on in the thousands of years since he was first programmed. And now the world is unrecognizable, but he cannot change to adapt.
Right.
And so
his
he's
instruction
just
set
mad.
Doesn't match his world anymore.
Right. And so he's just gone mad.
Yeah.
And yeah. So they split the party. This is the first time we've split the party. And we get two POVs moving at the same time. And it's Eddie and Susannah trying to find the cradle, which is Blaine's station. And then Jake has been kidnapped. So Roland and then eventually Oi and Roland are chasing after Jake.
Right.
And I really like Roland's pursuit of Jake because he could do it himself. But Oi's doing it and he's doing it faster and better. So he just follows Oi. And they have to run through this huge maze. They go into this underground area and
they find traps.
And
Roland avoids them.
Until he doesn't. He purposefully sets one off.
Right.
And then we meet the TikTok man who kind of reminds me of the trash can man from The Stand.
Yeah, he's kind of like the trash can man.
He even meets Randall Flagg.
Right.
Yeah.
And Randall Flagg asks him to say, "My life for you."
My life for you, yeah. And I was like, oh, I totally forgot that Stephen King had a through character. That
like
Randall
Hoyd.
Flagg. He doesn't tell him to call him Flagg. He tells him to call him something else. But this is Flagg. My life for you. And he destroys the trash can man too. Trash can man ends up like melting because he spends so much time on in the pursuit of what Flagg needs that he doesn't take care of himself. And then like TikTok man, Jake shoots him in the head, but he just scalps him. And so Flagg rips the piece of skin off of his scalp, off of his skull, and is like, there, that's better. Like ripping off a Band-Aid or...
Yeah, but then he heals it.
Yeah. And I was like, oh, okay.
There's a character
I
from a book series that feels very similar to the TikTok man.
Yeah.
And I think it's the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks, where the magic system is like taking in colors of light and then manifesting that color of light as either like a physical form, like red light, you can, I think they call it casting, into this like red gel that's flammable. And anyway, all the colors have different magical uses. But there's this guy, and I think his name is, everybody just calls him Shooter.
Okay.
Because he's really good at shooting guns. But he's this like mad pirate king.
Yeah.
And so he has this, I think he has a ship, and like the main character's story goes through, and he like Shooter loses his ship, but then later on Shooter shows back up. It's like a 7-book series.
Yeah.
And Shooter shows back up, but I think he might end up like helping out the hero's party.
Yeah.
But it's more, oh, it's you saved my life, or it was convenient for me in the moment to save you, or whatever. But this guy ends up getting like the supreme like magical like artifact, and for him it's a gun
Yeah.
that he doesn't need to load ammunition into.
Yeah.
And so he ends up like building up his group of pirates, and he gets this bigger ship because he has this ultimate artifact that
Yeah.
operates as a rifle for him. But it's a very similar vibe. He's just this wild, chaotic, like the completely chaotic neutral character.
Yeah, the douchebag dude, king of his douchebag kingdom.
Yeah.
In post-apocalyptic town. Luckily, he's short-lived, or I'd be real mad about it. But this is a real brutal section because...
But without understanding, I guess the key part is the douchebag leader of their douchebag kingdom, who is making use of some ancient artifact / technology.
Yeah.
To maintain their position of authority.
Right.
Without understanding
what it is they're using.
What it is and how to, what its purpose was for.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's exactly what it is. And this isn't a character archetype that I would normally... I will DNF a book if this character shows up. I will turn a movie off if this character shows up. Mercifully, he's short-lived.
Yeah.
And you're very much in tension at this moment because Roland keeps insinuating that terrible things could happen to Jake. He's like, I remember Jake liked these. He has in his backpack, he has all these little rocks and pieces of rubble, pieces of brush and things that he thinks are interesting because he's a 10-year-old boy.
Right.
He's like, I really hope they don't do something to him that takes that innocence away.
Right.
And you're like, oh.
He knows that they're going to, and he's just thinking, I hope I get to him before they do that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's hard. It's a hard read. We have a 10-year-old. And so for him to be like, they're going to rape him, basically. Yeah. And I need to get there before they do that.
Yeah.
And he does, which I'm extremely thankful for. I was just like, please, Stephen, don't do this to me. Please don't do this to me.
I think the main reason you've developed this massive dislike for the douchebag king of his douchebag kingdom is the most common way we see it used is as a cheap plot mechanism for delaying the main character.
It's a cheap roadblock.
And so whenever we run into this character, it's, the plot's going to stall out. It's going to come to a standstill.
Yeah, they're going to win and win and win and win.
To generate cheap conflict.
I hate it.
And draw out this story, like draw out the movie so that it's actually an hour and a half, even there's only 30 minutes of plot.
Right.
But an hour of it is going to be them just overcoming the douchebag kingdom.
Yeah, and
but the TikTok man, we get this character, but he's
a very brief stumbling. He doesn't, and he feels earned. You don't feel like he came out of nowhere to stall the party. The whole time leading up, Roland is like, this is going to be tough. Like, I know, Eddie, you think this is going to be good, but it's not going to be good. And it's going to be especially hard for Jake because he's young and they're all going to want him.
Yeah. So one of the reasons I thought of Shooter when I read about the TikTok man is because Shooter got into his position of authority because he's so good in a fight.
Yeah.
He's the best rifle shooter that anyone's ever seen. And then when the TikTok man is actually like in a fight, he's the fastest to draw and best throw with a knife.
Yeah.
And so he's not just this cheap opportunist.
Right.
He's kind of probably the most talented, like with a knife or whatever, in this city that's crumbling. And he rose to the top.
Right.
He took his place rather than just the author plopping him in.
Right. And King is very good at giving us like a full character with very little actual time spent on the page.
Mm-hmm.
And he does that with TikTok.
Yeah.
And he also does that with Eddie and Susannah are rolling through, literally because he's pushing her on the wheelchair. And the drums start and they hear something happening. And then this person comes out of a side alley and they think it's a child at first. And Susannah remembers how the gunslinger said, like, watch out. If you can catch them before they get to you, then if they have a grenade, it won't matter.
Right.
And so she realizes that this person has a grenade hidden behind their back. And so she shoots him. And then a whole group of people show up because there's an explosion because he did have a grenade. And then they end up shooting like 20 of these people.
Yeah.
And then the remaining ones are like, oh shit, and they're like, yeah, no, we're gunslingers and you guys need to take us to Blaine. And so they convince a couple of them to take them to Blaine's cradle, but not into it because they're like, no, that's forbidden. He will electrocute you.
Superstition.
And then before they leave, one of the characters looks down at one of the people that they just killed and goes, goodbye, Winston. Wait for me where the trees clear and the water's sweet, and I'll come to ye. As soon as dawn makes shadows run west. You're like, oh, that's really sad. Like I read a lot of books with Kate and Hannah, and I feel like there's a trend towards trying to make these really epic feeling books by including like armies and wars and battle, but they're just like the Q-tips that they used in episode 1 to imply that there's a crowd in the pod.
Oh yeah, in
racing.
episode 1.
Yeah.
Of Star Wars.
Yeah, they literally colored Q-tips and stuck them in the mini thing to make them look like
a
people.
breeze to make them wiggle.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's how they implied the crowd. That's what it ends up feeling like. Like, while we are literally throwing hundreds and hundreds of people to their death. And that's not mentioned as a bad thing at all. Because we have these super powerful characters and they have super powerful magic and blah, blah, blah. And you're like, okay, I mean, but also you just got like 1,000 people killed. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Right. What are the repercussions of that?
Yeah. Eddie and Susannah just killed like 20 people and they feel real bad about it. But we could have just been like, yeah, they were bad people, TM, TM, TM. But instead, It's like, no, they're just people. They're people who have lived in this place so long, it has driven them mad. Or as the gunslinger says, they're tired of living in their grandparents' graveyard.
Yeah.
Because they've watched everyone die. They know they are dying, but they have nowhere else to go. They just have the impulse to simply soldier on, knowing the world is moving on and that there's no hope. And that is a really bleak and really powerful and really impactful tone that King manages to set with very little actual exposition.
Right. It's dense.
It's dense.
And it's deep.
He creates a very tactile scene and then he sums it up with very little actual dialogue, like Roland saying they're tired of living in their grandparents' grave or living in their grandparents'
There's so
graveyard.
many implications from that.
And literally you as a reader can look back and see that like the speakers that are playing used to be used for announcements. Now they just play drums. Because they play them so relentlessly, they think they must mean something. And so now they sacrifice somebody every day. That's bleak as shit.
Yeah.
And none of the characters are like, wow, this is really sad. And we're all sad. And it makes me feel sad. But you get it. And you don't need to have the exposition because it's so well crafted.
Yep.
And then we meet Blaine. And Blaine is a pain, just like Jake predicted. Blaine straight up murders everybody.
Literally.
Yeah, because they wake him up, which everyone said don't do that, and they did it anyway.
Ka.
Oh, yeah. And remember how last time I said, you know what kind of references I could really get behind is T.S. Eliot?
Yeah.
Blaine makes at least 2 T.S. Eliot references.
Yep.
He goes, although I believe they can count on measuring out their lives in coffee spoons for a few more years. And there's another one where he goes, they're coming and going, but I don't think they're talking about Michelangelo.
Yeah.
And that's from the same poem. It's from the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock by T.S. Eliot. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And through circumstances, they all end up at Blaine. Mostly Blaine lets the gunslinger in. The gunslinger sends Oi in to try to save Jake, knowing that Oi is probably going to die.
And he feels bad about it.
And he feels bad about it, but also, okay, Oi,
It's
good
necessary.
boy, now go. And Jake totally loses the plot. He's supposed to be going and pushing the button because Roland telepathically tells him to go push the button. But as soon as he sees Oi, he's like, no, fuck you. I want to save Oi. And Oi's like chewing on people's ankles. And I think he takes somebody's eye out. Oi.
Yeah, he jumps right into TikTok Man's face.
Yeah.
And is like on his head, clawing and biting.
Oi is the best character in this and every other book ever. I love Oi so much. And then Blaine opens the door because eventually the gunslinger's like, wait a minute, you never pushed the button, did you? And he's like, no. And then Blaine comes
every time Jake tries to push the button, he either gets distracted or
he's trying to save Oi.
Gets pulled away. Yeah.
Yeah. And they end up following this floating orb through these tunnels that take them to Blaine. And then they figure out the riddle, which is you must prime my pump, but my pump primes backwards.
Yeah.
And so Susannah figures it out. She's like, oh, prime numbers. And so she gives this very succinct thing about how to figure out which prime numbers are between 1 and 100.
Yeah.
She's like, okay, first it's 1 and then it's whatever. And
yeah,
then
the sieve of Eratosthenes.
Yeah, the net. She calls it the net.
Yeah.
And so then she chalks out all the ones she can't push and then she just pushes them backwards. And Blaine is like, clever girl. And so he lets them in. And then Blaine's like, okay, now I'm going to kill us all. And so you better tell me some riddles. He's already set the city to basically self-destruct to release gas that will kill everybody. But Roland stands up and he's like, listen, Blaine, that's not how this is going to go down. You're not going to kill us. Or, I mean, you can kill us, but like, if we can figure out a riddle that you can't answer, because it's going to take Blaine 8 hours to travel like 2,000 miles.
What I really liked about this part is Jake has an insight about Blaine's state of mind.
Yeah.
Because, he had the whole whatever that provoked him to write that final essay, like my truth or
what is truth, I think is what it was.
And so he tells everybody, no, guys, you're thinking all wrong. Blaine's on a suicide mission.
Yeah.
And everybody, and
Blaine's like,
he does some explanation and everybody's like, oh okay. Yeah. Thank you, Jake, for your contribution.
Yeah.
We're all glad you're here. And you're a member of the party.
Yeah.
It's not just, Jake, you're someone we need to take care of. That's just getting dragged along.
No, he's a valuable member of the party. He brought the book and he brought the riddle book.
Yep.
And Roland is also a walking riddle book because we find out that was what they did as like a festival thing, was you told riddles.
And training.
And for training. To learn to think around corners is what he says. And he's like, but I wasn't so good at it. And Susannah's like, bullshit. Call bullshit on you, Roland. But yeah, because Blaine is like, okay, well, we're going to travel over the wastelands. We're going to travel a couple thousand miles. I haven't made this run in 10 years, so we hope all the track is standing. And Jake's like, don't you have a thing that tells you if the track has fallen down? He's like, oh, I would. Yeah, but no, I turned that off.
I burned out those circuits before we left.
Yeah. So, whoopsies. I guess we're just going to travel at the speed of sound and hope we don't fall off, because then we'll all die and it'll be okay. Because I don't give a shit if we all die. That's what I'm hoping for in the end anyway. And that's when Roland makes the bargain, which is if we can stump you, we can stay alive. Because he shows them what the wasteland looks like. And the wasteland is horrifying. And they could never have crossed it on foot.
Right.
Had Jake not told them they needed to go into the city to get the train.
Right.
Because they were going to go around. Roland's like, generally speaking, you don't go around. But maybe this time we go around. And Jake's like, we don't go around. We go get the train. We have to get the train. And it's because the wasteland is like not even nuclear wasteland. It's like beyond even that.
Right.
And that's where we leave it, which is all of the people in the train hurtling at the speed of sound. Blaine is basically holding them hostage. They have to find a riddle that will stump the train in order to save themselves. And the TikTok man has been brought back by Randall Flagg.
Yep.
Who is dressed like a gunslinger, like a cowboy. And that's it. That's the end of it. And the next book that came out was Wizard and Glass, which I'm almost certain is a prequel. And then Wolves of Kala doesn't come out until 2003.
When was Wastelands published?
1991.
Oh, okay.
So it was a 12-year gap. And when I was reading the introduction to the Wasteland, he was pretty much like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know where this is going to go. And I feel real bad for leaving you guys here. But also, you're going to be here for a little bit.
Enjoy the ride.
Enjoy the ride. And then he finishes up the rest of it in like very little time.
Mm-hmm.
Song of Susannah comes out in 2004. And then The Dark Tower also comes out in 2004. So he revises The Gunslinger the same year the Wolves of Kala come out, and then he finishes the rest of the series, all within a couple of years. And there's another one in the middle called The Little Sisters of Illyria, but it's a novella.
Yes, I've seen that as 4.5 in the series.
And he has another one called The Wind Through the Keyhole, but that's actually set between 4 and 5. So the remaining 3 books take 12 years to publish.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why Stephen King is who he is. I mean, Brandon Sanderson is the king of fantasy for a reason. And Stephen King is the king of horror for a reason. And I think that's on full display in the 3rd book in the series. And I have to say, I'm glad I was reading this for the podcast, because I would have read the first one and been like, I don't get what people are so fucking all about this for, and dropped it. And I may or may not have gone ahead and bought the rest of the books. Because I was at the used bookstore and they had them, and it just seemed like a really good idea to go ahead and buy the rest of the Dark Tower books, because maybe, just maybe, we want to finish the series for the podcast. Eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did you have anything else you wanted to add?
I was looking it up. Book 4 is not a prequel.
Okay.
It starts with them finishing up their ride on Blaine the Mono, which is what I remember.
Okay.
And that being unpleasant, and I
quit it.
DNF'd the book.
Okay.
The novella 4.5 is the prequel of about Roland.
All right. I just kept seeing Wizard and Glass referred to as Roland's origin story.
I think there are lots of flashbacks in Wizard and Glass, but then the novella does more.
One way to clear this up, and that's to read it.
So our original proposal here was go force ourselves, if necessary, through
the 3rd book,
and then see how we feel. So Rachel, after forcing yourself, air quotes, through books 1, 2, and 3 in the Dark Tower series, how do you feel?
I feel like I'm willing to give the 4th one a try, but I'm not committed to finishing the whole series.
Okay.
I feel like the first one was a slog. The second one had problematic parts. And then the third one was where the story really got going. And I want to know if we're going to keep that momentum in the fourth book.
Mm-hmm.
Or if it's going to feel like the first book all over again.
Yeah.
And I'm willing to give it a shot. I think that's where I've landed. How do you feel?
I'm willing to give it a shot. I think my evaluation of book 4 was probably biased because I binged the first 3 books as audiobooks, and I was probably just burned out on Blaine.
Well, let's do this. If you have an opinion about whether or not we should read the fourth book, you can let us know. We have an email address. It is thehosts@strangeandbeautiful.network. Or you can message us on Instagram @strangeandbeautifulnetwork. Or you can join us on Patreon. There is a free tier, and you can join the free tier. And I have been putting stuff up, and we're getting ready to do a watch along, and we're going to start releasing a Patreon-only movie episode every month, which I think this month is going to be Willy's Wonderland, which I'm really excited about because we just watched Willy's Wonderland.
With Meg as a guest.
Yes, with a special guest, Meg, who, if you have not heard Meg, she was on our Vamping Out with Meg episode, which came out on Come In 81 Kilo, and she is also the co-host of Garrick and Get It. So I'm really looking forward to that because I know we would just be like, Willy's Wonderland was the best movie I've ever seen. It was so good. And I know Meg is going to have opinions, and I'm really excited about it. So that's going to be our Patreon-only episode this month. And if we do the rest of the Dark Tower series, I'm not sure where I will release that because it's not on the schedule. And we do have we have kind of a timeline for our next season because we have a special guest lined up. So I guess we'll just have to see where that falls. But if you have a strong opinion and you want to make sure that we cover the rest of it, message us wherever you can find us. So either the email address, thehosts@strangeandbeautiful.network, or you can DM me on Instagram @strangeandbeautifulnetwork. And I think that's probably a good place to leave it.
So remember, sometimes the strangest things are the most beautiful too.
So be who you are and love what you love. Until next time, friends.
Bye.
Bye.